Get in, fellas. We're going back to therapy. It's session 15, and I'm dressed to the nines for the start of our psychodynamic or Freud shit block. This is the kind of therapy you think about. This is what Psych 101 taught you. We'll get ready to get it at way above a 100 level. Going to be joined by my buddy Satish. Knew him from fellowship. We're going to get way into the weeds about why psychodynamic therapy, or what you might think of as like analysts, Freud, New York City, fancy leather chairs, how that differs from the stuff we've learned so far, CBT and DBT type skill-based therapies. Before that, we're going to talk about attention. Ooh, they're doing that for attention. Why does my kid need attention? We all need attention. Get ready for a crash course. After that, we're going to end the show as we do and induct one of my favorite musical artists of all time, Kid Cudi, Cleveland, Ohio's own, into the Bro Motions Hall of Fame. All right, y'all, let's go. Attention is not a dirty word. Hey, I need attention. You need attention. Your kids, your parents, your grandparents, it doesn't matter. It is a basic human need. The need for attention develops when we're very, very young. We need to capture the attention of our caregivers to make sure that we're fed, our bottoms are dry, and that we have everything we need to survive. It's essentially why babies cry. They can't communicate. They can't say to you that they need to burp. They can't say to you that their diaper's wet. And that's what crying comes from. So there is a natural attunement that parents have to a baby's cry. This doesn't really change over time, okay? And so as we become toddlers, we have what's called the first individuation. So you start to walk away from your parents, and then you come back, you go around the corner. We've all seen this with toddlers. They kind of look to make sure you're still there, and then they keep on going. So this continues throughout life. They need attention. They need to know that you're going to be there and that you're going to be safe and stable for them. They also, as they go into latency age, which is elementary school, you'll have the phase of like, mommy, daddy, look at me, or they'll wave when they're in the school play. All very normal, natural stuff. They want to know that from their primary caregivers that they recognize them, that they see that they're learning, they see that they're growing, and that they're developing their own sense of autonomy. Teenagers, obviously, as they go through phases, want attention, need attention to fit into social norms. You know, that's the real theme of teenage years. And as we go through adulthood, the idea that we would shed a basic need for attention is just unrealistic. So when you catch yourself saying to your partner or saying to a friend, saying to somebody like, oh, they're just doing that for attention. Yeah. We all need it. We all do it. Look, I'm wearing this jacket to talk Freud stuff, hat, whatever. I wear goofy outfits. We all wear stuff all the time. We put on makeup. We put on nice clothes. We put on jerseys when we go to football games. I rock cool sneakers to get compliments. We all need this all the time. Even Doja Cat knows what it's all about. So we can't play music on a podcast because we get sued. So you're going to have to listen to me quote Doja Cat lyrics. Her song is called Attention. For the middle of the first verse, I could have been an opener. I redirected the booking. I read it and all the comments said, D, I'm really shooketh. Great use of shooketh. D, you need a therapist. Is that you looking? Yes, the one I got, they really are the best. Now I feel like I can tell you bitches is depressed. So the song goes on to describe her growth and her understanding of a basic need for attention is okay. That's something that's important to her. And she doesn't worry about how people talk about that or how they treat her as a result. The chorus runs, it needs, it seeks affection. Hungry, it fiends attention. It needs, it seeks affection. Hungry, it fiends. Yeah, it's a little sexual. It's Doja Cat, not a shock. So the problem with attention is when it starts presenting in unhealthy ways, or what we would call attention-seeking behaviors with adults. Again, asking for some reassurance, wanting people to say the meal you cooked is good, wanting people to compliment your outfit, normal spectrum stuff. When this becomes a problem is when somebody is creating drama and conflict just to make sure that they're getting their needs met for attention, feigning helplessness. Oh, I could do this on my own, but I want to make sure this person, pays attention to me. So I'm going to pretend like I can't do it. A damsel in distress kind of thing. A consistent need for affirmation. We all know what this insecurity feels like when it bounces off people and kind of that constant need for reassurance. And then we've all met like pathological liars, people who embellish stories and we go, why? Well, they want attention. They want to be known as a good storyteller. They want people to like them. This is not rocket science. The kind of people who do this attention-seeking behaviors most often are struggling with some sort of personality structure problem. We're going to learn about that in a couple weeks here on the psychodynamic block. And so the idea being something in their life led them to not get enough attention. Their upbringing, maybe they were bullied as a kid, anything like that, that still has them seeking positive affirmation. We don't need to be mad at these people. They're not, what are they doing to frustrate us? I always feel like what I see is people get like viscerally angry when someone's doing something for attention. And it's like, it makes total sense. We all do this. We all want it. In fact, we need it from our romantic partners to feel a sense of stability within our relationship. Yeah. And so this is a very treatable problem. If you find yourself being like, oh, should I do that? Well, first off, you're not alone. It's very common. And secondly, it's very treatable to tap into those roots of, hey, why do I need this? Right? It doesn't maybe need to be like, well, my parents did, yada. No, we're not talking about that. It's just like, well, maybe because my self-esteem is low and I need to do stuff to build that up. Or because my partner's not communicating with me properly and I don't know that they appreciate what I do, and vice versa. So these are things that can be addressed in therapy. And I wouldn't say it's easy to get over this problem, but I would say it's not the most difficult topic I deal with all day because it's very normal. And what can we do to help those in our lives who we feel need attention is we validate. Remember, everybody, the most important word you've never heard of. If somebody comes up to you and they're clearly looking for you to say something nice to them, or they're like, and like check out your outfit, right? You can just say, hey, you look really nice. And I'm busy right now. We'll talk later, right? You would do that with a kid who wants your attention. With your kid, you'd say, hey, it seems like you need my attention. I'm not available right now. I will come back and talk to you in blank time. You're addressing that they want attention. That's okay. You're not calling them manipulative. You're not screaming at them. You're just doing this for attention. We need to understand that children and people want attention. Other things to do if you're in a situation like that is we need to set boundaries with somebody, especially an adult, which is, hey, if you need something, we need to communicate clearly. I'm not going to respond to, threatening behavior, you pretending to be helpless, telling another story, right? These are things that do really get under our skin. And so we need to make sure that people in our lives know that, hey, this is not the way to communicate, that we need to communicate clearly what our needs are. In fact, I was talking with a couple recently, and I was occupying a lot of the husband's time. And I heard his wife go in the background, hey, wrap it up. I need attention. And I just cracked up. I thought, man, as weird as that sounds, it was actually very nice. I mean, I'd been on the phone with him for an hour. Their kids were already asleep. And she communicated clearly, I want your attention. And so I thought that was super healthy. And so maybe talking about that with your partner, what does that look like? How can you guys show yourself, show each other attention, praise, affirmation, affection throughout the day in smaller ways when maybe you don't have time to be showing attention in more healthy ways or more grand romantic gestures. So just really my takeaway point from all this, guys, is that attention is not unnatural. It's something we all need and something we all seek, whether we know it or not. Especially when we're struggling with depression, anxiety, or personality issues from trauma, that this is all very normal spectrum stuff. So I don't want you saying to people, oh, they're just doing that for attention. Again, guys, when we're feeling judgmental, let's be curious and flip that and go, I wonder what it is that has them needing so much affirmation, so much, what's the insecurity about? And in that position, you'll be able to validate, you'll be able to learn, and actually maybe be able to help them out. Because imagine if you just yell at somebody, oh, you just want attention. Let me tell you, you're not going to get them to the finish line, friends. All right. So speaking of deeper psychological themes, we're going to start this Freud shit block with my boy, Dr. Shashi after the break. See you soon. So ZYXWVUT SRQB ONML. We are a couple of smart cookies, Dr. Shashi. So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining today for the first interview in our psychodynamic, also called psychoanalytic, also called our Freud shit block. I am thrilled to be joined by one of my dear friends from training, Satish Shashi. Say hello to the people, Satish.
Hey, folks. Nice to meet you. Thanks for having me, Steven.
And because he works with kids, you'll see there's a lot of H's and a lot of I's in the name. And so he just goes by Dr. Shashi. Just like any immigrant family in this country, they don't feel like waiting for white people to botch their names. So Dr. Shashidar is a good friend of mine. I met him out in Colorado at our child psychiatry fellowship. Again, we as psychiatrists work with adults, and then we specialize in children. That is what Satish and I have done. So learned a lot about children and families and how apt to have child-trained people to talk about these psychodynamic lessons, which have a lot to do with our upbringing, our development, and our childhoods. Satish hails from the great state of Florida. He went to the University of South Florida. And I think you were there when Charlie Strong was there and they were any good, because that was the last time.
It was a little bit after that, I mean, I don't know that we were ever really any good after 2007. It's been a rough couple of decades.
Sure. For sure. And you even had UCF upstage you for a little bit. That must have been rough.
Still have.
He is a Southwest Florida sports fan. So the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, there was a window of time when his Buccaneers, the Lightning, and then just randomly, well, not randomly, he did residency up in Wisconsin, so he's a Milwaukee Bucks fan. So there was a period of time where Satish could get fucking bent because all his teams were winning around me and I was not happy. What was that? That was like during COVID, like 21, 22?
It was basically like 2020 to 2022. In that, it's like it didn't matter like what I did or what happened. It was just I at least had one championship sports team to fall back on.
Yeah, you see that? So, what he did, we all assume as sports fans that we have a reason for our teams winning or succeeding, right? He's like, I could have done anything. I was just bulletproof. So Dr. Shashidar, in addition, since leaving fellowship out here in Colorado, he and his wife moved to Virginia. They work at Inova Fairfax as a healthcare system out there, and he's the medical director of their consult liaison service, specifically with kids and teenagers. So we haven't touched on CL stuff. Satish, tell people what CL psychiatry is.
So, I mean, it's basically psychiatry just in the medical hospital. So we get consulted for any number of things. For some kids, it's, dealing with anxiety about a prolonged hospitalization. Other kids, there's complex medical illnesses that may be masquerading with psychiatric symptoms or the other way around. A lot of times it's just working with families who are maybe a little bit more challenging.
Sure.
Who might be interfering with what's going on. So it's just it's a decent mix of different things.
Yeah. The point Satish is making is that these kids were admitted medically and then they call psychiatry to help, not admitted to a psychiatric unit where he also does work there too. So in his free time for his mindful hobbies, Satish enjoys clay shooting and golf. So really looking forward to touching on this stuff, Satish. I think what I want the people to know, and maybe they'll have heard this from me in the intro already, is psychiatrists love this psychodynamic shit. We fucking live for it. So I've got Satish, my buddy Zach, Tarek, Mario, a bunch of guys who just we just bleed this stuff. This is what we get excited about. This is the kind of therapy you think of. This is the kind of therapy that when people are scared of it, this is kind of why. We're going to ask to dig into your past. We're going to understand the why of why we do things. And of course, that can be really scary for people. Satish, we're going to want to review the types of therapy we've done so far so that we have a good way of contrasting the differences as we head into this block. What are some examples of why people come to see you for therapy?
So I think on the consult side and on the inpatient side, it's almost exclusively going to be depression, anxiety, and then on the inpatient adolescent units, 50% borderline personality disorder.
Right.
So we're looking at someone who's just in my world, it's someone in crisis, right? Someone who is, functioning differently than they typically would due to experiences that maybe they have some control over or maybe they don't have control over. But by and large, it's going to be some form of depression, anxiety. And those are just our global words, right? They mean nothing without the actual symptoms behind it.
Yeah.
But if you want to cull it down, that's the main point.
Yeah.
That's the main reason.
I really like that comparison, right? Those are our umbrella terms: depression, anxiety, focus and concentration issues. We're going to go through, we're going to reference a video by Dr. Jonathan Shedler, and we'll give you the information in that video earlier. He refers to depression, anxiety as a fever. In the medical world, a fever is a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that there is an infection or an immune reaction somewhere in the body, but it's not specific. So when somebody comes to us and says, I'm depressed or I'm anxious, we don't really know why, and there could be a reason or there could be no reason. And that's the interesting thing is, so I want to share, I'm going to share a number of things throughout this presentation, mostly some exciting pop culture references to all this stuff. But first up, just to give you a flash, like all the different types of therapy out there. We have only touched on CBT. We did ERP with Harrison. This was the core of the challenging social anxiety. We've learned DBT, some mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is kind of like what DBT is. And now we're over here into psychodynamic therapy. So internal family systems is unique. EMDR is a type of trauma therapy. Acceptance and commitment therapy is used a lot for addiction. So this is only a small sample of the types of therapy out there. And so thinking about why you might want to go to therapy or why somebody in this audience might be seeking therapy, the type of therapy and the type of therapist you end up with does matter. So what we can see here is we haven't even talked about interpersonal therapy, which is kind of like a blend between psychodynamics and more of the cognitive things. It's a shortened version of understanding your relationship patterns. But we've learned about CBT. These are structured and skill-based things, guys, which is why we were doing worksheets and we had modules. These are the kind of things that if you're looking for a therapy that is meant to solve a problem, these are the kind of therapies you go to. All right. Like you see, CBT is about changing our negative thoughts. We did that all the way back in episode 5 with Eric, where we did the sports-based cognitive distortions. We also talked about changing our behavioral patterns. We did that with AJ in episode 4. We talked about how to express our emotions with Richie in episode 3. And then again, Harrison came on to challenge those social anxieties in episode 7. So help yourself back to that if you're jumping here in the middle. DBT, we just finished that module, guys. What was the theme of it? Was to slow it down. All right. So psychodynamic therapy isn't teaching you those skills, right? DBT is meant to help slow things down so we can communicate effectively, get our needs met, not make things worse, just like we've learned over the last few weeks. So Satish, how would you, before we dive in, how would you describe psychodynamic therapy? Like, interestingly, because I'm asking you, because it's hard to do that.
So, first, with CBT, DBT, I think we're both child psychiatrists, right? Like a bulk of what we do is based on one of the BT type therapies, right? Sure. The behavioral therapy. So there's absolutely a place for all of them. And I think with kids, we tend to go towards those because they are so digestible and algorithmic almost. And there's still flexibility, but not quite like psychodynamic, right? And psychodynamic, I think the biggest thing is you have to have the luxury of time to really get into psychodynamic therapy. Whereas if you have a kid who's trying to get back to school and just trying to function normally,
especially like a teenager, a kid with big explosive ADHD emotions. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's really hard to do that with the longer term psychodynamic therapy, and they just may not buy into it, right? So the CBT, DBT, ACT, all those are, we use them all the time, right? Every day we're teaching skills in that. Psychodynamic's a little bit different, right? Psychodynamic is, I think in general, it is going to be a more prolonged course of therapy that doesn't necessarily focus on the acute or immediate stressors that are going on. It's more things that have kind of been uncovered over time, and that it's dealing with issues that are kind of set in conditions that were, created 20, 30 years ago, right? So you're talking about someone who from birth on has developed a certain way of interacting with the world that has worked for them. And maybe it's not anymore. So how do you work with these kids or adults to figure out why you might be doing something?
If you're watching this, you saw my face cringe up when Satish said it's working for them. What we mean by is it's not driven them to the point where their defenses are down. So we're going to learn about defenses here in a minute. We're going to talk about defenses in 2 episodes as a whole separate construct. But people come to therapy when they're depressed or anxious. And the idea of when they're depressed or anxious means whatever they're trying to do to keep themselves from being depressed or anxious, denying, rationalizing, intellectualizing, subliming, right? Sublimating, then these things, if they're not working for them, are going to produce those symptoms. That's the idea here of what Satish said of it's working for them. I would say that sometimes people know what they're doing if it's not, it's not necessarily working for them, but right, their defenses are strong enough, Satish, that they're not thinking that things aren't going well for them. So Satish hit this wonderful point, and we do psychodynamic and psychoanalytic therapy with kids. So those terms are interchangeable. Psychoanalytic is the term that we used over 100 years ago when Freud and his friends were starting this, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Psychodynamic is what the more modern firm goes to, or again, just like Freud shit, if you want to stick with that. Play therapy, when you think about a kid like reenacting a trauma, going into play therapy, I think that's all something we've seen or heard about. That is psychoanalytic work with children. You can't do the same things that you would do with an adult because they don't have the insight and they don't have the language necessarily for some of these like past experiences of theirs. But if you're having a kid, re-experience what goes on in their home or what went on in a tragic event, that is very similar. That is child psychodynamics. Satish and I have a handful of friends who are training and practicing in that way. So if you're watching at home, I put up this pros and cons, and I know not everybody watches, but there's a nice grid here. And Satish and I have just kind of broken this down, right? Psychodynamic therapy is meant for if you're interested in understanding the why behind your behavior, if you have these feelings about your relationships from the past that you think are still impacting your future, and you want to get close with your therapist, you want to explore what stops you from getting close with somebody, what stops you from being vulnerable, why you attach to people too quickly, whatever your patterns are, that is what psychodynamic is meant to do. And then you can already hear me and Satish talking and how much we all love this stuff, right? Like this is the juicy stuff. This is the stuff that, yes, does scare men and people, men specifically, because they think we're going to start going this deep. Even in psychodynamics, the patient sets the pace. Okay, so I just want to remind you that if you start seeing a therapist who claims to be doing psychodynamic work, that's fine. They just want to get a history. They won't talk about things until you're ready. Okay, why you wouldn't want to do psychodynamic therapy, because it isn't for everybody. It's time consuming and it can be expensive, is if you are goals oriented. Like Satish was saying with CBT and DBT, if you like to have a number or a metric to measure your progress, that is not the case in psychodynamic therapy. For example, I've been in psychodynamic therapy. When I talk about my own therapy, that is what I've been doing all these years. What are my metrics for getting better? I'm better at self-advocating. My self-esteem is better. I'm not as like presentably anxious to people, right? It's not finite concepts. It's vagaries and general progression. So Satish, what have it's been your experience? I mean, I know you've been in therapy in your life. Have you done this type of therapy? I mean, this is kind of your jam as well.
This is so for our training, we kind of started in our second year of residency, and we did psychodynamic therapy. My program was very heavily psychodynamic, which is one of the reasons that many of us chose to go there, is because there was some interest. I literally knew nothing about it going into it, aside from what you might read on like Wikipedia, right? So there was no knowledge going into it. But during my second year is when I actually started doing the therapy, and part of that was my supervisor saying, it's a good time to do it. It's like, there's no better time to do it than when you're actually trying to practice it, and you can kind of learn a little bit more about yourself. So I did it for 3 years. And like you said, it's like, I didn't necessarily have a specific goal in mind. I think I knew that there were certain things that I might not have gone for, or things that I would hold myself back from, because I was worried, like, how is this going to work out? Like, what are the consequences if it doesn't work out? And that sort of like preemptive shame keeps you from maybe challenging yourself a little bit. But over the course of 3 years, and I can't point to a specific like epiphany that I had, it's just over the course of 2.5, 3 years, things just became a little easier, and I understood why I may not have been going for things. And it pushed me to maybe try for some like opportunities, whether it's in jobs or careers, etc., that I never would have thought of going for.
Yeah.
So for me, it's not that light bulb sort of moment. There was nothing that I could write down and say, on this day, my anxiety went from a 9 to a 7.
Right.
It's just that I noticed that things got a little easier.
Mm-hmm. I would be remiss if I did not show everybody that Satish and I are very dressed to look professional while also broy today. Sorry for not leading off with that, but we have our blazers and our elbow patches because we're ready to be super fancy shrinks. Well, we got to get you updated wardrobe. So we're ready to be fancy shrinks today, like psychodynamic people do, but we're also still bros. So Satish, I want to think about too, because people have heard me talk about like I felt like I was bad at this. This is the kind of therapy I felt I was bad at, right? People can teach CBT and DBT, and I also benefited from that tremendously, especially DBT, like I've talked about. But this idea of like, why do I do things? What's going on for this other person? How to understand the dynamic between us and the dynamic within us at the same time. That is the stuff that I was bad at. So in my program, Satish came and joined us in my fourth year, but my third year is when we leaned on that stuff really heavily. And that was when I was having these moments, and we would have a supervisor who practices this kind of therapy that we'd meet with every week. And I would say stuff, and she's like, okay, you're trying to get them to mentalize, which is like put themselves in someone else's shoes. And I was like, I don't know what that word means. Right. And it's just stuff like that where it was just like, I didn't know what I was trying to do until I got more invested in this type of thinking and had to do it myself. And so if you really want to get fancy with it, so Satish and I, neither of us have done extra training in this kind of fancy therapy. You all, if you're listening to this, have probably heard of psychoanalysts or the common dating app thing when you see a therapist on Bumble or Hinge and they go, I promise not to analyze you on the first date. Well, let me tell you what, guys, I don't promise that. Because once you start thinking like that, it's hard to turn off. I always want to know how comfortable somebody is in their own skin, how connected they are to their past in a healthy way. So what's funny, it's you know, that's the kind of analysis we think of is like, don't you like be looking at my insecurities and like telling me about my mommy issues? And it's like, dude, once you start understanding that shit, it's hard to turn off.
And at the same time, you're like, we can't really analyze like a completely blank space, right? You can to a certain extent. But if you remain completely mute, it's like that's one way to live your life. Sure, we won't be able to tell you much, but it is really hard not to pick up if someone says something, and especially if you have a background and kind of understand why they got to that statement. It's hard to do, but it's not something that we're doing for the purpose of like judgment. It's just like patterns that you notice.
We talked about this with Carolyn when we did the 5 questions to ask your bro's fiance. Was I talked about the adult attachment interview? I mean, when you ask somebody to like, tell me about your family, like I'm not trying to be a dick on a date. It's just like you pay attention to how people answer that question. And through this block, our learners are gonna learn, our watchers and listeners are gonna learn what that should look like, how you can have a rough childhood and still speak about it in a cohesive narrative pattern, right? Like we have to understand these things that happen to us and be able to talk about them without losing our shit. That's the core concept of what we're looking for. Not everybody had a good childhood. It's okay. I mean, it sucks. It's sad. And the key to success is being able to say, well, this was my mom's issue. This was my dad's issue. Like, I understand why they were how they were because of how it was for them. And that's the kind of work that psychodynamics will teach you. That's the kind of stuff that you may want to get if you're listening to this to say, why are my patterns like this? Because of stuff that I was exposed to and probably stuff that they were exposed to, right? That intergenerational trauma is both biologic and environmental. Like that is what we know at this point, that both of those things are true. So if you want to become a fancy schmancy New York City analyst, Satish, what do you have to do?
To get to that level? I mean, so that's the thing is that you don't have to be a psychiatrist, right? You effectively just have to have a terminal degree in anything.
Yep.
And then you can apply
a lot of psychologists or psychoanalysts too, and even some social workers and counselors. Yeah.
Yeah. But then you have like, Ellen Sachs, she's an attorney by trade, like, Center Cannot Hold. She went through analytic training she had her JD. But, it's usually a 4 to 5 year process. You are having your analytic cases, which in general, they'll all go about 200 sessions each. So I think you have to have about 3 of them to actually get qualified as a.
So what Steve is explaining, if I wanted to become a psychoanalyst, this big fancy, ivory towers thing that we think about it. I mean, it's still to some extent is like that. I think there's really good authors and really good analysts. Nancy McWilliams, Jonathan Schindler. We're going to reference these people who write this complex stuff in a language that helped me learn it, that helped Satish learn it, helped all our friends. So I and others certainly want this language to be more accessible because as you can already hear, this is stuff that people want. An analytic patient means that I would have three, four, five of my own patients that I'm seeing for an hour a day, 3 or 4 times a week at minimum, if not 5 days a week, which is bonkers. We're just telling you guys about this stuff. I'm not really expecting anybody to go look for this stuff because it's super unique. Maybe you dip your toe in the water 1 day a week and then 2 days a week, and depending on what you have to work on. So you'd have a few of those, and you're constantly staffing or getting feedback on those cases from somebody who's already done the thing. And then you're also in your own analysis with somebody who's done this thing already. And that's also like 4 times a week for 4 or 5 years. So it is a motherfucker to become an analyst. And so you might understand why they take so much pride in this stuff. We're going to hear from one of our buddies, one of Satish's co-residents, Tarek, who's coming on in a few weeks. And when I tried to get him to like dumb down this stuff so that even I could understand what he was saying, I was just like, Tarek, man, like I'm not teaching this to other psychiatrists. Like the general public can't understand what you're saying. And so people just love this stuff so much that it's really hard for them to kind of simplify it because that's how much like jazz there is behind it. So I wanted to do a quick tour because we did this with CBT. We talked about Aaron Beck, and we did this with DBT. We talked about Marshall Linehan. So a little bit of the history of psychoanalytic, psychodynamic therapy. It's Freud. It's Freud shit. If you watch the BHoF of episode 3, you saw me talk about this, so you're free to skip it, but it's good shit to hear again, right? So Freud was a homie in the early 1900s. He was practicing as a neurologist in Vienna, Austria. As Freud was once quoted as saying, it is hard to deal scientifically with feelings, okay? So Freud was a neurologist, and he started seeing well-to-do women who were showing symptoms at the time that were called hysteria. Okay, so these are neurologic type symptoms that did not have a neurologic origin. That could look like seizures that were not coming from real seizure activity in the brain, coming from stress. It could be like, my arms don't work, but like there's no reason for their arms not to work. Stomach pains, fainting spells, any of that kind of stuff. And again, we used to call these symptoms hysteria or being hysterical because that implied it's from the uterus. So that tells you what kind of stuff we were thinking about at the time. So Freud started on this journey with these well-to-do women, and then he figured the connecting factor between these people was that they had all experienced sexual trauma within their homes. And so we're talking incest. I know that's scary. Trigger warning. I'm sorry. It's the truth of what happened. Freud goes to publish on this stuff. And of course, his well-to-do patients' families were like, no, don't you go publishing on the fact that we have incest in our homes. If you do that, you're not going to be alive very much longer. So Freud took a hard left turn and started doing the weirder stuff that we know him for. I'll give one more shout out to Freud because you all have already heard me do this. One of Freud's most famous patients was a girl her parents wanted him to see because she was attracted to women. Freud saw her for a couple sessions, discharged her, and told her parents, there's nothing wrong here, guys. She's totally fine. She's rock solid. She just likes women romantically. So we don't think of Freud as like an LGBT advocate or necessarily a feminist because of these theories and how I think people interpret them. But to know that this was the idea here was that he was trying to put a language and an explanation to things that nobody had ever tried to do that before. So the field of psychiatry came about in that way. The history as it progresses is a lot of people liked reading this stuff. His own daughter is the source of defense mechanism, so we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. Next week, we're going to just cover Freud, stuff you've heard about, the id, ego, superego, interpretation of dreams, Oedipal complex. So we're going to get weird, guys, but that's the history. And as time went, people came up with other ideas around these concepts. So they're nerdy things called object relations. Attachment theory is something we're going to talk about. So we'll get to the other stuff we're going to learn about later in this block, but that's the history behind it, is that 100 years ago, we had more than 100, but about 100, we had no way of identifying a problem if it wasn't putting a leech on it as the answer. And Freud was trying to identify, what's going on for these people. So Satish, I'm interested in your thoughts. I mean, how do you think of, analytic training as as like a source for how you practice today?
So, I mean, I think for us, it's all about how we got trained, right? And so for you and I, we both went to programs where maybe the psychodynamic aspect was we just leaned a little more psychodynamic,
Yeah.
but
Oh, yeah.
there are what we call like
Versus
biological
biologic.
programs too.
Right. Okay.
Right?
Yeah. Sorry, guys.
Yeah.
Satish and I were at different programs. I was in Colorado. He was in Wisconsin. We had excellent therapy training compared to the standard out in the field for psychiatrists.
And I think the standard is really it's like CBT, DBT, and you sort
Some
of
addiction
touch on
stuff.
psychodynamics, right? It's like you learn about Freud, and that's about the extent of it. It's like you know that he was involved in psychoanalytics and psychodynamic theories, and that's really about all you need because that's what you need for board exams, things of that nature, right? This is not what most psychiatrists are doing. But I mean, I think for psychodynamic therapy, the reason that it's so interesting and the reason that it's both difficult to get into and also a little bit easier to start with, in my opinion, is that it really just stems from like a lot of curiosity, right? You can just keep asking questions about everything that's going on, not to the point where you're just really annoying someone, but anything that happens in the room, there's a question. It's like, well, it's grist for the mill, right? It's like you can take that, you can take every interaction and say, it's like, is there something behind it? There may not be, but you do get to have a lot of that curiosity. And like one of my old supervisors, pretty much says like, yeah, for patients who are kind of transferring to you the first time you're seeing, if you have this whole history from other psychiatrists, other therapists, just kind of scrap it all, right? Yeah. It's like your relationship is kind of starting fresh. You are starting new.
When someone transfers to me in my company, yeah, we just start brand new, which annoys the hell out of people.
It does.
Yeah.
For medication, sometimes that's a little different. But when you're getting into like therapy, it's like the whole basis of this is, transference, countertransference, right? And we'll get into that too. But that's a big part of what makes psychodynamic therapy. If someone wants something that is like more regimented and more algorithmic, and they want someone to sort of tell them or lead them to do something specifically, psychodynamic may not be the best choice, right? It's like we are in this position. We're basically saying it's like, I can probably help you come to some sort of answer, but I don't know the actual answer. It's like, you kind of know the answer and I can suspect things. But ultimately, if I tell you that, if I interpreted that for you, it's not going to be as powerful as if you come to that conclusion yourself. And so that's what psychodynamic is like. That the fun part of it is just
insight. Yeah. And we're going to see
increasing insight.
We're going to see in a few pop culture clips coming up. So we're going to talk about the 8 principles of psychoanalytic therapy. So this video that Satish and I borrowed these themes from is by Jonathan Schendler. He's a big deal psychoanalyst out at UCSF. And there's an awesome, if you're into this kind of stuff, YouTube channel called Picturing It with Elliot. He's a psychoanalyst out of New York, and he's just rounded up all the big name homies in the field these days. You're going to hear about my girl Nancy McWilliams, the GOAT, a bunch. And they just talk about this kind of stuff in ways that you're like, fuck, goddamn. Like that's where I want to be learning from these people so that I can use this podcast as a format for speaking a normal language and explaining complex concepts. So Satish, these are the principles. I'm not showing this up. We're just going to go one by one. The principles of psychoanalytic therapy. Number 1 is that we focus on emotion. Now, that's not that much different than other types of therapy. What's different about it is that we're trying to have people understand the emotion more. Rather than be able to name it, we go a step deeper into understanding those emotions.
And I mean, so I think the nice part about like this, when we talk about emotion and we think about like psychodynamics, is like, yeah, you can be angry. It's like, but it's like, did your anger present as you just kind of sort of quietly yelling at me? Did it turn into you like jumping out of the chair and really screaming? Did it turn to you just getting like more withdrawn and irritable? Like those reactions are so important in psychodynamic therapy, where it's like, okay, yeah, we're angry, but that's not actually as important as the actual like event that happened, because then I can point to that event and be like, well, let's explore why you did that when you're angry as opposed to the other thing when you're angry.
Right. And so we need to be accurately labeling emotions, and then we call people out and this happens with me all the time, because you guys know I'm a pretty fiery and honest therapist. If one of my patients is not angry about a situation that they should be angry about, I'm like, why am I more angry about this than you are? And that is often the therapist's role in psychodynamic therapy, is holding that emotion and sometimes modeling it, and so like I had a kid whose mother had passed away about a year before I started seeing him, and he was not on track to graduate high school. And by the time we got to the end, he was able to graduate. And I just remember I said to him, like, your mom would be so proud of you. And it was this like moment of like, I needed to to say that he was not in touch with that as a 17-year-old boy from down in the spring. So we're going to like model those emotions for our patients. We're going to do pop culture examples with each of these. Then Satish and I'll touch on them. So we're going to cover a lot of ground. I'll keep things mostly a secret, but it's probably no surprise who's up first. Let's go.
How you feeling, Ted?
I'm better. Not great, but better.
Good. Because when someone's not great, that allows me to get in there and do my thing.
Yeah.
So Satish, when you see that, what do you think Dr. Sharon is thinking about when she says, like, no, I need to see you hurt?
So I think it's more that there is at least some outward expression that you can deal with. And so it's like we were saying earlier, it's like if someone's completely silent, I can't do much with that.
Right.
If there's at least some outward expression of like what is going on and acknowledge that something is not at baseline or is not going well, then we could, go a little bit further. I don't know that I would say it's like, I'm glad that you're hurting as a therapist. But at the same time,
I mean, no, it's not crazy. I mean, that's the idea here. Again, guys, you're going to hear us talking about breaking down defenses. We all lie to ourselves all the time, every day. Ted Lasso exhibits what we call the manic defense. Okay. It's very classic. He had trauma growing up. And so everything's fine. Don't show that you're hurting, up to the point that we've seen Ted starts having these panic attacks. That's why he starts working with Dr. Sharon. So what she's saying is, if you walk into my office and say you're fine and you're bringing your cookies, Dr. Sharon, you're not going to get anywhere in therapy. Ted needs to show that he's not invincible, that he is vulnerable, and that he has chinks in his armor, or else Dr. Sharon's not going to be able to get anywhere with it. The therapy will not progress.
And like the hard part of the manic defense really is that you're just constantly on the go, right? And that's what you see is it's like every single moment has to be filled with something. And it may be just completely emotionally just perverse or in the other way, just blunted, but it's just something that keeps you from experiencing that emotion, right? The emotion that came from decades ago in this case. If you haven't seen Ted Lasso at this point, I was like, I don't really know what to tell you. It's like I'm not trying not to give anything away.
I mean, it's the show of the like this, and then like Scrubs when I talked about Bill Lawrence, like this is the show's vibe. So right, if you need an Apple TV account, I think I actually borrow Satish's. So just let me know and I'll give you Satish's information. I might still be on that. I guess I'll when I go watch Bad Monkey, I'll let you know if that's what I'm logged into.
I'll split it with you. It's like $250 a month at that point, right?
Well, I don't have an iPhone. I refuse to get one, so they won't let me sign up. So the next thing, and we have heard this already. I'm so excited because this will not be foreign to you guys. In psychodynamic therapy, we study the avoidance. Satish, you've been a loyal listener. What do we say about avoidance?
I don't know. You tell me.
Damn, you're not there into that yet. All right, I'm going to have to cut that because it won't be as smooth. Avoidance is a dirty word. We cannot avoid our feelings. Right. We cannot avoid our feelings. And so we understand that already as an audience of Kinder, Gentler Bros, that we have to be able to face our feelings. And this is where defense mechanisms come in, right? When I say we lie to ourselves, that is to imply that we make excuses, but we don't do it like on purpose. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. It's like kind of a mid, it's what we call like pre-conscious, not unconscious, not conscious, but somewhere in the middle. We're like, you all see this happen every day. You ask your husband or wife what's wrong, and they're like, nothing. Or like, what about you? Or like they flip it back onto you. All these types of interactions are things that people do without even thinking about. So they're avoiding whatever the thing is they don't want to talk about. They're avoiding the feeling they don't want to feel. And that is what therapists do in those situations. They say to people, why aren't you expressing more anger? Why aren't you mad at this person? Why aren't you saying you're disappointed? Like the things that you might expect somebody to feel. And then, if I were you, I would feel blank. because these people are detached from it, you know? And so what, you know, and I think we'll talk about the role of medications on this show ongoing as we have just kind of intermittently. Sometimes we need to use medications to set people up to not be defended. They need to have their depression, anxiety lifted enough so that they can talk about these things. This is also the point of drugs and stuff. Psychedelics, because as anybody in this audience who's experienced those drugs knows, those drugs break down your defenses. LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, ketamine, all those things are meant to break down your defenses so you can talk about the truth without freaking the fuck out. So, any thoughts on avoidance, Satish?
I mean, I think avoidance is kind of classic, right? And I think it's like something that we all just naturally do at some point in our lives. There's very few people who haven't done that, right? And that can look like different things. There's avoidance, and then there's like, in your term, you were talking about a few cases where it's like, how are you not more upset? There's that potential, like that isolation of that affect, right? Where it's just like, I'm going to come out and I'm going to look perfectly fine. And it's like, why are you here, right? It's like, clearly something's going on. And we know that these things happen. So it's sort of like, well, why are we doing this? What does it get us to isolate that affect? What does it get us to avoid? And that's just further what we're talking about is just, it's all grist for the mill. Like anything that happens in therapy, like any way that you react to me or I might react to you or how you perceive I might react to you, that's grist for the mill. And that's what we're talking about.
If you're not following us on the socials, we're going to start doing a defense of the day starting the day this episode comes out. So there's 26 defense mechanisms, give or take. Those are the 26 most common that we think of in our world. They're rated immature, or you could say, immature and then mature, but there's like a little middle period too. And so we're going to talk about one each day on the socials, and I'm going to give you a pop culture example of that occurring, kind of like we're doing today. So really sign up for that. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to using a wide variety of pop culture references. But first, one of the best scenes of therapy in movie history. Let us step into a great example of avoidance as played by John C. Reilly.
So, Dale, I don't know if you know about therapy, but it usually starts by you telling me a little something about yourself.
I work at a college as a janitor, even though I feel like I'm smarter than most of the people that go there. Sometimes I see an equation written on a blackboard, like half an equation. I'll just figure it out.
Is this Good Will Hunting?
No.
Nope.
Sounds a lot like the plot of Good Will Hunting.
Yeah. Anyway, my best friend is Ben Affleck.
So I thought we'd begin.
All right, don't worry. We're going to finish off that scene a little later, and we'll also get to Good Will Hunting. So, the idea of kind of like a denial or a deflection. He's avoiding talking about anything in his life serious by making a joke about it, right? Using humor as a defense, which we kind of consider like a medium maturity. It's kind of in the middle, depending on the situation. So that's just like a funny example, right? The doc asks him why he's here and what we can help with, and he just totally takes it off course and has no interest in going there.
Yeah, it's avoidance. It's like, it can be like, it can just be like acting out as well in terms of humor. It's like you have like primitive and mature defenses, like all in 1.5 minutes. It's something that I think we see with patients like all the time. Probably not to that.
We see it with our friends. We see it in real. I see it
absolutely.
1,000 times a day in every interaction I do.
Yeah.
Like somebody does something to offend you, and you're like, "No, it's okay." It's like, no, it probably wasn't okay. You know what I mean? And it's like worth saying out loud, like, no, I didn't like how that went. And so not
a classic Midwest, like, I'm sorry for like doing nothing, having done nothing wrong. It's like, I'm just going to go ahead and apologize.
We do not apologize for existing in space. We do not apologize for existing people. Come on. So I said that to somebody who bumped into me at an Ohio State football game last weekend, and they were just like, damn, man. It's like, yeah, I know. We don't apologize for existing in space. So the number 3, there's 8 of these. We're going to get through 3. It's a long session, but I think we're all going to really enjoy and benefit from learning this stuff, is we identify themes. Themes are something everybody understands. Why do I always date these dirtbags? Why do I always get in my own way? Why do I self-sabotage? Right? These are themes that come up in your life. We have a concept called repetition compulsion. This has maybe come up on the show before. How do you define repetition compulsion, Satish? Because I felt like I was different than some of my friends and had to go check myself before.
To be honest, I don't really know. I need to see how you define it.
Nah, it's fair. Maybe that term's not as common. So I'm going to run it back and I'm going to redo that so that it doesn't put you on the spot and make you look silly. So kind of identifying themes, we talk about a term called repetition compulsion. And that is the idea that a person spends their life trying to master a specific theme. Now, whether they know they're trying to master it or not, or whether they're truly trying to master it, it depends on who you ask. But the idea is that they just keep wrestling with this theme over and over again. And that some, theorists believe that is because of something that happened in their life. So some theorists would say that you just repeat those patterns without any subconscious intention of solving them. So let's say you had, as a young lady, an alcoholic abusive father. Well, you would just continue to date alcoholic abusive men because that's your compulsion to repeat the theme or the pattern. So that's where that comes from. And that's why even people in you guys in the audience, like you could say to yourself, oh shit, I do that same thing over and over again, don't I? And that's, it's depends on the depth and how serious it is.
Yeah. And I think it's, part of that is like, what did that alcoholic abusive father do in your life, and how did that change your just general being that made you interact with certain people in a certain way, right? So if you had someone that was really really dismissive or really absent, you might be in a relationship where there's much more attention, right? It may not be attention that you love or that you want to perceive necessarily, but it is something. And so if those relationships go away, it's like, well, I need to meet someone else that's going to fit that profile. And I know that this person, even if they are dismissive of me, it's like they might still give something that they might meet some need that I feel like I'm missing, right? So it's like these themes they're hierarchical, and there's certainly it's kind of an umbrella term. There's so much that falls underneath that that kind of leads us to just generally acting how we act. But yeah.
The things that happen to us impact our view of ourselves, others, and the world. We're going to head back to Ted Lasso for an example of how a theme in his life shows up in the show. Hold on. First, we're going to actually share the screen and do all that stuff. Sweet.
Ted, it's not surprising that you had a panic attack. It's possible that going to this funeral would trigger memories of going to your own father's funeral.
Nope. I didn't go to my dad's funeral.
Okay, why not?
Because he quit. He quit on his family. He quit on himself. And I hated him for that. I think I still hate him for it.
I think you do too, Ted. And that's okay. What happened with your father is a difficult thing for anyone to make sense of, especially his teenage son. Do you agree?
Okay.
Okay, good.
What do we know about Ted Lasso? He does not quit. He believes. He will not give up. Where does that come from? We're picking up on the theme. This does a nice job of showing that if spoiler alert, but Ted's dad commits suicide when he's a teenager. And Ted refers, we're going to get into this again on our next topic, the finishing of that scene, that he quit. He quit on himself. He quit on his family, and that Ted is not going to quit on people. That is not something he can do, given how traumatic that was for him. The next thing we talk about in psychodynamic therapy is we focus on development. This is the part that scares people. This is Dr. Schindler. I really like this quote, that we're interested in the past to the extent that it helps us understand the present. The goal is not to understand the past, but to help free them from the bonds of past experiences. So people are really worried about the therapist is going to want to know every nook and cranny of these bad things that happened. And I say this to patients all the time. I only need to know what happened to the extent that we can understand why you're doing the shit you're doing now. Because we're not going to necessarily change those things that happened in the past. We might be able to reframe how you think about them and what you've internalized, but we're not going to change it. And nor can we, truly.
And I mean, that's a concept that goes across like all types of therapies, right? And I think that's what I say to kids all the time, especially with trauma. It's like, I cannot change what happened to you, but I'm hoping that when we work through this and we continue to go through this, you might remember it, but you're not going to have that same reaction that you did the first time, like those panic attacks, those nightmares, everything. It's like it's not quite as what would the word, intense as it used to be.
Right. You kind of you integrate it into your experience so that it's not boxed off. It's not alone by itself. So if you've already watched the full episode here, my opening scene this week was on we all grow up. Excuse me. I'm going to edit this out. If you watch the beginning of this show, you heard that my opening segment was on the concept of we all get older. It does not mean we grow up. This is an idea of developmental trauma, and we're going to keep, this is the body keeps the score. We're going to do a development lecture later in the psychodynamics block. This idea that every few years or every period of our life, depending on which theorist, which, psychiatrist was coming up with it, that there's things we're meant to do, things we're meant to master, skills we're meant to gain, positions we're meant to learn. So when I talk about feeling a sense of safety in the world, that implies that if you had something happen very young, the very first thing you need to do as a baby is understand that you're safe and be taken care of by the people around you. So that is where, certain types of trauma, we think borderline personality come from, is that if you had an unstable sense of safety early on, that projects out into everything you do from that moment on. How you see the world, how you interact, how you interpret interactions. So that is, again, another way of thinking about development is, do I need to know every single detail about these moments in your life? Not necessarily, but I can take that information and understand what it's done to fuck you up and how you're fucked up the way you are. We're going to finish up that scene with Ted Lasso here as he continues to talk about how his father's suicide impacted him.
Why don't you share with me what happened? I'm sorry that happened to you, Ted.
Yeah, me too.
And I understand why you're angry with him. He took a lot away from you.
And my mom.
And your mum, yes. I'm curious about something. What was he like?
He was a good man,
What did you love about him?
Why?
You told me what you hate about him. I'd love to hear something you remember that made you feel good.
I think he would have known how good he was. That stuff he didn't really care about being good at. I don't think he would have done it. And I wish I would have told him. I wish I would have told him more. I was just so angry at him. Because he was always gone at work and just out with friends or something like that. And then he was gone. And I knew right then and there that I was never going to let anybody get by me without understanding they might be hurting inside. Life, it's hard. It's real hard.
Thank you, Ted.
Life is hard. Sure is, Ted. Thank you for your honesty there and sharing with us. So what I took from that is that, that loss has again, why we think of the development in this situation is it has stunted him emotionally. He has not, Ted Lasso, we know, is a great man, a great father, but we also know that he truly lacks emotional depth as a result of this trauma, right? And so that's the idea here is like, he has not been able to incorporate all of this into the idea here. Ted is so scared of showing negative emotion that it led to him blowing out of him outside of the karaoke scene, session where he had that first panic attack. That is a sign. Again, anxiety and depression are an umbrella. They are a fever for Ted having these deeper issues of not having accepted this trauma, not having accepted the realistic nature of his divorce. He just has a hard time accepting these things as they are, which is an important thing that humans need to be able to do, is accept reality. It's difficult. I don't always want to. As you learn and you grow, you should be able to accept things that are real, whether you like them or not. The most interesting part about psychodynamic therapy is that we focus on the relationship itself. Satish alluded to transference and countertransference. Big Dog, you're up. Explain to the people what that means.
So, I guess at its core, the easiest way is transference is how your patient feels towards you as a therapist, and countertransference is your reaction to the patient. That's real, broad. But that's effectively
I think about it as what how they influence me thinking about them, right? It's like kind of that interpersonal dynamic.
Yeah. And I think that, the transference is like what we often think about is like, is the transference just towards you as a therapist? It's like, no, it's like in psychodynamic therapy, we're often seeing like whatever these emotions are that are coming up for these patients about a different relationship, they're often projected onto us as a therapist. So they're interacting with us in the way that they might interact with that person with whom they're having that interpersonal conflict with, or replaying something that has gone on before and putting us in that role.
So this is the idea that like you might want a male therapist, you might want a white therapist, you might want somebody who you're going to feel a certain way about to help you master and understand an idea. This is also the concept of, I don't know what I was going to say. So we're going to use a really good example of transference, countertransference within another scene here. Give me one sec. This is a pretty straightforward transference as we continue the stepbrother scene.
And talking about your parents' divorce.
Okay.
How old were you when they got divorced?
15.
A hard age.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about some of those feelings?
I love you.
Obviously, you don't know me.
I love you so much.
Thank you. And I will take that as a feeling that you have of comfortability with me.
It's more than comfortability. I fucking love you.
Okay.
I'm just thinking about our life together. I feel like I'm walking on a cloud. My penis is tingling right now.
That is so off-putting.
You're not feeling this?
In no way, shape, or form do I feel any feelings of intimacy towards you in any way whatsoever.
Well, it's a real bad example because he does end up dating his therapist, as we know if you've never seen Step Brothers. So bad boundaries. We can't do that. No. We focus on the relationships in general in psychodynamic therapy. So this is attachment. This is understanding what our role models were as far as our parents' marriage, the types of examples we had, examples of gender roles, things along those lines. I'm always just kind of leaving it empty. I need to be better at pitching it to people. So Satish, when you think of, because we're going to do a separate lens, we're going to do a separate episode on attachment. So when you're thinking about relationships, I tend to think about it as like, we need to understand what those relationships were like so that we can understand the lens at which the patient sees the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, we think about our earliest attachments, right? It's kind of scary to think about, is that like a lot of how we develop as an adult is reflective of like how we were raised from like 0 to 2. So it's that concept is like, were people present enough? Were they focused on us? Did we get what we absolutely needed in life? Right. And that's the part where we also go, and it's like, there's that concept of like, good enough. And I think for parents who are listening, it's, you don't have to be perfect with your kids, but you do have to be good enough. And often what that means is you're present, you're supportive. You don't necessarily take away all the anxiety or stress from your kids' world. That's probably more dangerous in a different way. But you are kind of showing them it's like they can explore and they can always have like a safe home base. So those are like those like early relationships that really get reflected later on. Same thing with like early like first relationships, like first relationships after like puberty and everything like that. Those are all going to influence how we are 20, 30, 40, 50 years later.
Totally. Satish has not seen the show that we're going to use as an example, but I love on Amazon the show Fleabag. If you have not seen it, please, dear Lord, help yourself. Let me also pull
it's on
this.
The list with like 600 other things, you know?
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
But hopefully this inspires everybody to get on board. I believe the actress won an Emmy for this work. Very funny show.
Excuse me, I've got dry forearms.
Sure.
So why have you come to the session?
It was a birthday present for my father.
Is that a joke?
No.
It would be good not to make jokes in here, just in case anything gets lost in humorous translation.
Oh, I don't know if I can do that.
Is that a joke?
No.
Huh. Just try not to make it very obvious.
Sure.
So why do you think your father suggested you come for counselling?
I think because my mother died and he can't talk about it. And my sister and I didn't speak for a year because she thinks I tried to sleep with her husband. And because I spent most of my adult life using sex to deflect from the screaming void inside my empty heart. I'm good at this.
Yes, the main character talks to the audience throughout the show, breaking the fourth wall. I just use that because it's like dad this, mom that, sister this, yada yada, like knows herself. So the understanding of like relationships, what her dynamic, summed up in just like a funny way. So another thing we focus on in dynamic work is fantasy life. All right. So most other therapies aren't giving much to dreams, to your daydreams, to your fantasy inner world. And that is what we really enjoy playing around with in this type of therapy.
Yeah, I mean that's the stuff that's like interesting and just a little bit more creative. And there are theories of like what certain dreams might mean, what like what you're daydreaming like could be interpreted as, but at the same time, we're trying to step away from the old like stereotype. It's like with Freud, it's like you say one thing but you mean your mother. It's like that's not quite the case, right?
You mean your mother? If you heard that joke, now it's good.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's just a lot of play and there's a lot of creativity, and eventually, like I see dreams and daydreams as like there's something that is more in the unconscious or preconscious that kind of gets brought up when you have no filter anymore. And so those are important, and because like ultimately in psychodynamic, we're looking to bring that unconscious to the conscious and at least acknowledge what it is.
Totally.
So like the fantasy life is fun, right? It's like, and everyone's can be super weird, and that's the interesting part.
Speaking of super weird, we're going to carry on with that scene from Fleabag for an example of talking about the fantasy life within therapy.
I want to fuck a priest.
Catholic?
Yes.
A good one?
Yes.
Looks good in the...
Yes.
I understand. Do you really want to fuck the priest, or do you want to fuck God?
Can you fuck God?
Oh, yes.
Just please tell me how to not fuck the priest before I get arrested.
Well, I don't think fucking a priest will make you feel as powerful as you think it will.
Can you just tell me what to do?
You know. You already know what you're going to do. Everybody does.
What?
You've already decided what you're going to do.
So what's the point in you?
You know what you're going to do.
No, I don't.
Yes, you do.
I don't.
You do.
So that's a little bit of our last point too, but the idea of a few things there. One, we are exploring her fantasy world and her desire to have this forbidden relationship. The priest is a real person. So it's not fantasy life to the extent that she knows she can't do it, wishes she could. Basically is like saying to this therapist, like, make me stop wanting to fuck this very attractive, if you've seen the show, priest. And He's just like charming, good dude. And so she's like, I can't do that. That's not what I do. We don't tell you what to do. That is what the behavioral therapies do. They tell you what to do. There is a dynamic where the therapist is going to give you advice and suggestions. This is not the case here. That's why that the analyst that she's seeing is very adamant about, like, you already know what you're going to do, because her presumption probably is that, given her history, knowing her, is that she's going to sleep with that priest, because she already knows that she's promiscuous. She already knows that she's impulsive. And so I think the therapist is emphasizing the point of, like, doesn't matter what I say, homie, you're going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's where you guys are going to go into like id, ego, and super ego. And you're going to, you'll cover all that in the next few weeks.
Right. Those unconscious drives and the mean angel and devil that play on our brain, ego, id, super ego. That's how we'll describe it next week. And then that scene also brings up our final point of what dynamics is about. Is it's also about the therapeutic alliance. And so you can see them like going at it. And that can be the case in therapy. Like, your therapist should not always be supportive in the ways that we think. They should not validate bad behavior. Like, if I have a patient who's telling me they keep going back to an abusive situation, I feel for you. I can see why this happens, but I'm not going to sit there forever and ever and say that you will have the green light from me to keep doing these things, right? So if somebody's screaming at their boss, right, we understand why and why they're so angry, but we can't validate that bad behavior. So there is often conflict between the therapist and the patient.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if with the teenagers, Satish, you're pushing them on any specific stuff.
Oh, all the time. All right. And like I have the benefit of seeing them for 5, 6, 7 days. I can't do full psychodynamic therapy, but I can do some uncovering and interpreting, and I can at least push them a little bit when I know that they're acting against themselves, right? And so I probably use more like accurate, like acceptance commitment therapy. I use a lot of those techniques when I'm dealing with short-term sort of issues, but with kids, I think part of psychodynamic therapy is challenging them, right? It's like, you're not going to get any growth if no one challenges you on those behaviors. I'm not going to say, it's totally fine that this is happening. And it's like, I'm so sorry that this happened to you. And we're not going to try to address what may have led us to some certain decisions. Because ultimately, it's like, why are you coming to therapy at that point, right? It's like, it feels inappropriate for me to do that. And it feels like I'm not really helping. I don't have the chance to help doing that.
Right.
But you do have to, like, this is all built on, like, the first day that I see someone is going to be very different than 3 months, 6 months, 9 months down the line. If you don't have that rapport, and it doesn't mean that you're their friend by any means. But if you don't have that sort of back and forth and comfortable rapport, you're never going to be able to challenge them, right? But so you do have to build on that. They do have to know that you have their best interests.
That's it. I mean, my first hour with a person is all spent around building a therapeutic alliance. I act in non-threatening ways. I want an accepting tone. Nobody's, if they've shown up that day, if you have come to see a psychiatrist, you deserve a lot of credit. And that is what I make sure the patient knows. The past has been the past. You are working on these things. You made this effort, and it's worth us capitalizing, is what I want people to hear. And then as we go, I still, let people know that they're fucking up. So one of the most famous scenes in therapy and movie history, we're gonna wrap these pop culture references and get towards the end of the show with a great example of when the therapeutic alliance isn't always pretty in Good Will Hunting.
I want to be a shepherd. Really? I want to move up to Nashua, get a nice little spread, get some sheep and tend to them.
Maybe you should go do that.
What?
If you're gonna jerk off, why don't you just do it at home with a moist towel?
You chucking me?
Yeah, get the fuck out.
No. Time's not up yet.
Yeah, it
I'm
is.
not leaving, no.
Listen, you're not gonna answer my questions. You're wasting my fucking time.
What? I thought we were friends. What do you mean
Playtime's over, okay?
Well, why are you kicking me out, Sean? You're lecturing me on life? Look at you, you fucking burnout. What winds your clock?
Working with you.
Where's your soulmate? You want to talk about soulmates? Where is she?
Dead.
That's right. She's fucking dead. She fucking dies, and you just cash in your chips and you walk away?
Hey, at least I played a hand.
Oh, and you played a hand and you lost. You lost a big fucking hand, and some people lose a big hand like that and have the sack to ante up again.
Look at me. What do you want to do? You and your bullshit. You got a bullshit answer for everybody. But I ask you a very simple question, and you can't give me a straight answer. Because you don't know. See you, Bo Peep.
Bo Peep.
Fuck you. You're the shepherd.
I can say comfortably I never caught that Bo Peep reference right there when he's referring to him becoming a shepherd. Pour one out for Robin Williams, first off. But that's a good example of how, Robin had to withstand that storm to get back to the point. I mean, Matt Damon in that scene is blowing up because he can't answer Robin Williams' question of what are you going to do with this gift that you have, this intelligence that you have? What are you going to do? And he doesn't know, obviously, and he's struggling with that. So Robin's sitting there and taking it until eventually Matt's able to be like, nah, you're right. I just don't know what the answer is. He doesn't say that, but he doesn't say anything, which is impossible for him in that role. So guys, I'm really looking forward to using these pop culture examples as we go because I think it's fun. I'm going to use them when we start doing the defense mechanism of the day. We're going to try and use them as much as possible because this is like the fun way to see therapy. And again, hopefully normalize it for everybody and get people involved that might not otherwise would. So we're going to wrap. I want to share what we're going to cover the rest of the block. So in no specific order, these are the kind of things we're going to talk about. So I've talked about this block being the Freud shit block. Okay. These are all things that Freud talked about. This id ego, super ego. We've heard of that, right? It is mean. Super ego is our conscience telling us not to do bad things. Oedipal complex. You want to sleep with your mom and murder your dad, all that stuff. We're going to talk about dreams. Defense mechanisms we touched on today. Personality structure, personality disorders, what that means, and more importantly, is that people don't just pop out the womb with borderline personality disorder, right? How these things develop, and more importantly, how we all have traits like this on a spectrum. They all look different, but they are similar on a spectrum. Attachment theory, that's the stuff that you've read. If you've read the book Attached, we're going to talk about childhood attachment and how that impacts relationships now. We're going to talk about development. So when you pop out the womb, what are you supposed to be doing at any given time? And I'm not talking about stacking blocks or how many words you can say. These are the psychological concepts of what you're supposed to be doing. Piaget, Erikson, all the homies, right, Satish? So we're going to talk self-states. So self-states is the idea that we are one person, even if we experience a wide range of emotions. That is like Inside Out 2. The reason I want to talk about self-states is because very commonly today, people talk about dissociation. We also talk about dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder, which is a complex topic we're going to dive into, but that comes from the same idea as self-states. And then finally, is going to overshadow everything we do, is this idea that things that happen when we're young impact us not only mentally, spiritually, also physically. So that is going to be an underlying current throughout this whole block, is the things that happen to us go on to impact us in more ways than you might ever know if you haven't done looking into that. What are you most excited about, Satish? I don't know. You coming back on for another episode?
I can. No, this I love this stuff, right? Like I don't get to do it as much in like the formal format that I used to be able to do. So it's fun to talk about, and I think the hard part about like psychodynamics, and we've talked about this before, is like a lot of times it seems inaccessible. It's just, and if you leave true like psychoanalytic theory, it is just incomprehensible. Even after a ton of training, it is like some of these things I'm like, I really struggle to grasp the concept. Dr. Yakub, I'm sure, will be able to better explain some of those concepts.
That's Tarek.
That's
who I don't know if he'll be able to better. That boy really loves the details. I said, can you dumb this down, Tarek? And I don't know that he can. We will see in a couple episodes. Next week, we're going to have on a good buddy of mine, Zach Demko, who works in Nashville now. He did his child fellowship at Vanderbilt. And we're going to talk about all the Freud stuff. It's just going to be fun, guys. I want to demystify these things. I want, more importantly, if you're going to use this kind of language, attachment, borderline, all this stuff, I want us using it accurately, and I want people to understand what this stuff means. There's nothing that grinds my gears more than people using this language out in the world, either incorrectly, but more importantly, meant to be offensive or meant to insult somebody. And I'm not trying to gas people up to have those opportunities. I want you speaking in accurate language as everybody's learning in those episodes. So Good shit, Dr. Shashi. It's a lot of fun, man.
I appreciate it.
People recall at one point, I referred to the way I think about practicing child and adolescent and even adult psychiatry as 80% therapist, 20% medication prescriber. When I asked Satish what his number was, he goes, don't you think it's more like 90-10? So that lets you know, guys, that I know psychiatrists, you don't think about this stuff, but like, listen to us. This is what we love. This is what we live and breathe. So of course we're going to prescribe medications if they're needed, but keep your eyes and ears open, man, because a lot of these people that maybe scared you in the past have a lot to teach. So enjoy teaching. So, all right, y'all, we're going to come back and induct a new Bro Motions Hall of Fame inductee and then wrap up the show. Thanks, Dr. Shash.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Let's go, Buffalo. Welcome back, y'all. For BHoF today, we're going to induct one of my all-time favorite music artists, Scott Kid Cudi Cudi. Born in Cleveland, Ohio, youngest of four. His parents were a middle school choir teacher in Cleveland Heights, the home of our boys Chef Max and Taylor Swift's boyfriend. And his father was a substitute teacher. Unfortunately, his father passed away from cancer at age 11. We know this as it went on to shape much of Scott's personality and his music from there on out as we know him. Kid Cudi came bursting onto the scene in 2009 with a song we all know and still remember, Day and Night, which talked a lot about troubled past, moods, how they change. And then the later release of the Man on the Moon album, which was lined with mental health and emotional tones. And Scott telling the truth about depression, about how these things impacted him, about substance use that was covering up emotions, that he was burying things inside. So again, the theme of Cudi's career is that it wasn't always pretty, and yet he was always very honest. Mental health issues continued on for Cudi throughout his life, dealing with depression, suicidality, and drug use. He did, become sober years later in order to be a better role model for his daughter, but even ended up in depression and suicidality treatment, residential treatment in 2016. So it wasn't as if fame increased. He felt better. It's a good lesson, right? We might think that these celebrities have it all, but things were still not easy for Cudi, even as his star grew and he earned a lot of money and respect. He made an album recently, Insano 2024, which was great, continued on with many of his similar themes. And he's hinted at this may be him winding down. And, he's been such a role model to so many, even stars like Pete Davidson and Travis Scott, whose name comes from Cudi. The stage name Travis Scott is from Scott Mescudi. And then Logic. These guys have all talked about him as an inspiration and even hinting at his music saving their lives. Travis Scott even has a lyric, Rager, from Kid Cudi on his body as a tattoo. Logic, of course, as we know, is very emotionally laden in his music. And so, Cudi really, I want to induct as the Bro Motions Hall of Fame member, one to point out that how we role model for people, it's not always going to be pretty. I mean, I don't know that Cudi would say that his mental health journey has been pretty, and yet he's been honest. He's been out in the front, and like Atmosphere did for a lot of guys in the late 90s, Cudi picked up at a point of rap music where there was no emotional, North Star as far as commenting on anxiety, depression, suicidality, things like that. So, really owe Cudi a lot because rap artists since then have really been able to set the stage as having emotionally vulnerable music. So thank you, Scott. Thank you, Cudi, for really inspiring me. I know that music coming out when I was around 21 played a major role. And I know that I still fire up Man on the Moon for long drives, probably a couple times a year. So hope you're doing well, buddy, and want to make sure we honored who truly is a Bro Motions hero setting the stage for rap music that we all know and love. All right, we'll be right back to close out. All right, y'all, going to close out our show as we do and cite our sources. So throughout this block, while we're talking about the Freud shit, we're going to be using some of the big dog hitters of the day. Nancy McWilliams, Jonathan Shedler, Glenn Gabbert are some, Freuds of their time. Freud, Anna Freud, Melanie Klein, all people you're going to hear about. So we're going to be using some of their literature from back in the day and some of the current day stuff. That Picturing It with Elliot YouTube page that I referred to with Dr. Shedler's video, really cool. Tons of cool stuff on there if you're interested in understanding psychodynamics from a different angle. Also, shout out to Jonathan Shedler, who, when I emailed him to say thank you for making that video, emailed back and said, keep fighting the good fight. Thanks, Doc. Other stuff we used, a bunch of YouTube videos to explain those ideas of psychodynamics. We also used Very Well Mind and Psychology Today articles to help me think about attention. And Cudi, I just pulled that stuff from my mind, man. Thanks for being great. So as we do, let's take 3 takeaways from this episode. 1, attention is not a dirty word. We don't need to be frustrated when people are showing they need attention. It's a very straightforward need. 2, psychodynamics is cool. Thinking deeply about what happened in our lives to inform why we do the shit we do now, as scary as it is worth our time. We're going to do it a bunch over the next few weeks. And number 3, that being a bro-emotional leader does not always have to look pretty. There's no playbook for it. Thanks, Cudi, for always telling the truth. And remember, at the end of this day, we're going to do each week what we asked to do, which is let's find ways to be kinder and gentler out there, all right? See y'all next week.